Hello and welcome to the British Sitcom History Podcast. My name is Alan. With me, as always, is Gareth.
Hello, the British Sitcom History Podcast residents. Gentleman of the house speaking.
Oh dear. Okay. Here's a little clue for you. So, yes, we are opening this series with the modern classic, Keeping Up Appearances.
We certainly are, as everyone will have recognised from my Hyacinth Bucket accent there.
Yeah, very good. Well done. Keeping Up Appearances with the infamous Hyacinth Bucket, Patricia Routledge, of course. We're going to go into all the details. We're going to look at a specific episode, and then we'll look at the background of the show and what everyone did afterwards. That's our MO.
The episode we're going to look at is from Series 5, Episode 3. And it's the one where Richard forgets their anniversary and much hilarity ensues.
Classic
so that's
sitcom
That's the one we're going to actually review. But can I, before we even get started, I'm just going to pick up on something you said in your introduction there. You called it a modern classic.
Well,
now,
with perhaps a little sense of irony.
I'm going to question both of those words. No, do you know what? I think classic is fair. We'll get into over the next couple of episodes. We will get into how much of we enjoyed it. But I think it's fair to call it a classic. But modern. So this is interesting. Like when was Keeping Up Appearances made? Now I kind of remember it from when I was a kid, and the answer is it was 1990 to 95. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, 44 episodes over that period.
But this is very much, bear in mind, we sort of watched Game On recently, a 90s sitcom. This is contemporary with that, 1990 to 94. But it could have been made any time, really, couldn't it?
I think something I'm going to do a lot in this episode is draw references to One Foot in the Grave. And when we
said the same thing about One Foot in the Grave, didn't we? One Foot in the Grave spanned the 90s and felt timeless. And I would say that's similar here.
Definitely, these two shows are contemporaries. The One Foot in the Grave ran till 2000, but its main thing was the first half of the 90s, and it just sort of did specials after that. So they are a very similar time period, and maybe it's our age as well. Maybe it's our generation, but there's this kind of post-90s technology shifts considerably. We've got mobile phones and the internet and stuff like that. There is a very significant sort of change in culture, which shows, as opposed to, say, the 70s to the 90s, it's probably not that different into, fashion or whatever. Also, both of those shows being written for characters of an older generation. So they're kind of harking back to something perhaps older, but written by people who aren't that old. Actually, Roy Clark was about the same age as Patricia Routledge.
We talked about this when we talked about Game On, how when you make something that is self-consciously of the now and of the moment and cool, it very much anchors it in time. But, in the 1990s, if you were a young person living in a flat in London, then yes, that would have been your life. But most people weren't. Most people were married, living in the suburbs and like this. And the 90s they were not at the cutting edge of fashion. Just like in the 1960s, most people were living the life of Al Garnett, not the scarce git.
Yeah, and there's certainly not much in Keeping Up Appearances to put a date on it particularly, is there? Because it's not representing the 90s.
It's a comedy of manners. It's a comedy of, wanting to keep ahead of the Joneses. And I think Hyacinth Bucket as a character, as a caricature, could have existed just as easily in the 60s, 70s or 80s.
What about now? Could you remake this now?
I wouldn't, because I think it's awful, but I think one could. I just tipped my hand slightly there, didn't I?
You gave away your thoughts there.
No, but I do. Yeah, I do think you could. I think this character still exists as a caricature, as a trope.
Now, in British sitcom particularly, we come up against this all the time. Class structure and the class system of Britain is obviously always there. In Keeping Up Appearances, it's kind of raison d'etre. It is its founding principle. So what we have here, if anyone hasn't seen the show, is our principal character of this very sort of socially rising middle-class couple. The female of the couple is our main character. And she comes from this very kind of dirt-poor working-class stock. And we have her relatives there as regular characters to remind us of that.
Yes. So we see Daisy and Rose, her sisters. We see Onslow, who is Daisy's layabout husband. And that's her roots. That's Hyacinth's roots. That's where she's come from. Her husband, Richard, is they're absolutely not all that well off. He works for the council. You know, they are middle class, and it's not so much about class as it is about pretension. It's about her wanting to be more than she came from and always striving for more. She's never happy with her lot. She's never content. She's always wanting to be better thought of. And that's a crucial point. It's not just about what she is, it's about what other people see.
Yeah, it is. It's all about perception. It's keeping up appearances. It's not keeping up standards. It's about how you appear. That is the absolute central tenet to the character in the show. And the Bucket Bouquet thing, so their surname is Bucket, spelled as you would spell bucket, but she pronounces it bouquet.
It's bouquet.
Yes.
Anybody who's, if you haven't seen the program for years, if you just go on YouTube or iPlayer and watch 4 minutes of any episode, you'll see that joke done.
Yes. Yeah, done many times.
Many times. And not with any originality. They don't do any angle on it. No. It's just her being annoyed that someone's mispronounced the name she's decided to mispronounce herself.
But to be fair, it is a great central concept. It's like if you started with that idea and built a sitcom around it, the name is Bucket. It's a crap, horrible name. And she's made it into something pretty and beautiful that seems much better than it really is. And that's what she is. That's what she does. She very rarely kind of outright lies about things or where she is. She just polishes it up and makes it look the best it possibly can be. But even Richard says it was always Bucket until I met you. So, even he's a bit sick of it. Fair enough, someone sees that name for the first time, you would pronounce it Bucket, and then you would go, oh, fair enough, she wants it pronounced bouquet. But why can the vicar, the postman, the milkman not get that into their head every single time they go?
They get it wrong, and she has to give them that withering look, and they correct themselves. Like, it's not as if they're reading it off a script. Oh, hello, Mrs. Bucket. Oh, sorry, bouquet. Like, yeah, we've done this before. I'm sick of it. I know her name, and I'm just watching.
Yes, but the whole show does rest on the sturdy shoulders of Patricia Routledge, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I think so. Before we get into our episode, why don't we tackle Patricia Routledge?
Yeah, and I think perhaps to her own annoyance, this is what she's remembered for mostly. I
guess so. It's certainly the biggest hit she had, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, let me put it to you. What else did she do? What's Patricia Routledge? Why Patricia Routledge is a dame of this fine British Empire. So what's she done to deserve that? Because it can't be just keeping up appearances, right?
Listen, if you'd have asked me 3 weeks ago what's she famous for, I don't think I would have had a second bullet point. I've watched a few of the older things she was in, and she's part of Victoria Wood's extended family, isn't she? And we can talk about the Kitty sketches in a minute, but that's kind of the only other thing I really know her from. I don't really know anything she's done since, and I've seen some clips of her as a younger woman, and you think, oh yes, that's Patricia Routledge, but I don't remember this.
Yeah. Well, her reputation really was in theatre, and keeping up appearances is kind of the exception to that. She was slumming it for sitcom, and that obviously is just a lot more publicised than theatre work. But yeah, she was born in 1929. As of recording, she's still with us. She's still going. Yeah, she was born in Tranmere. Kind of lower middle class stock. The father was a haberdasher, I think it was, sort of.
Good trade.
She went to university, got a degree in English language and literature at the University of Liverpool. And it seems like she got her interest in acting there through the Drama Society at university. And
so we're talking late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, I assume so. And was encouraged into the industry, which was obviously good enough that people were like, oh yeah, you should do this. And she did. She went into theatre, and more specifically musical theatre. She was a singer as well.
She can sing. There's a sort of running joke here. She's trying to impress the neighbour with her singing, and she's a bad singer. But she actually can sing, can't she?
Oh, yeah. And in fact, she won a Tony Award in 1968. So on Broadway, she went in Brock, America. So obviously she'd spent a decade building a reputation by that point.
Anything I would have heard of the show?
No.
I'm not a musicals aficionado.
Yeah, she's got a litany of awards and nominations and things, and I kind of looked through them and I'm like, I don't really know any of these shows. None of these have really kind of been amazingly stood the test of time or anything. But there you go. She did win a Tony in 1968, and there's a bit of a flurry of credits in the 60s where she's obviously hitting a peak of her career, first peak at least, and people were going, oh yeah, come and do this, come and do this. So she's in a sort of a series of films, a few British films and things like that. And I think she just sort of, nothing much happened. She went back to theatre. And then there's a whole 70s. She's doing lots of theatre, but then also lots of things that didn't do that well. Didn't get a big hit, you know? I think that's what's sort of just missing. So just working, really. Got a little bit more notoriety again in the 80s. And part of that was down to Alan Bennett. She was in A Woman of No Importance by Alan Bennett. That was a sort of a teleplay. Yeah, that play was a precursor to Talking Heads because it is basically a big monologue, but a longer form. And she was the woman in that. That was 1982.
Okay. So hang on a sec. So 1982, she's 53. So, we're not talking about overnight success here.
Well, no, but she was very successful in the theatre, don't get me wrong. She just wasn't the sort of household name that people watching telly are going to know. So then she's just started transitioning, and I think she's one of those people, we talked about this with Richard Wilson as well, who's kinds of ages into when she looks right for the kind of thing she's playing. Like Patricia Routledge, you've seen her as a young woman, like in 30 years old, making a guest appearance in a show or something, and it's like, that's Patricia Routledge, but she looks kind of weird and too young. Yeah. Some people just have the right age, don't they? So I think that definitely happened with Patricia Routledge in her 50s and 60s. And then Victoria Wood, the character specifically of Kitty.
Anyway, she said, Kitty, could you possibly fill my slot for me? I cannot cope. I've left me culottes on the underground. It was trainee day at the bikini waxers. Yes. And I've got a raging case of premenstrual tension. All this in a voice loud enough to blow the froth of a Horlicks 2 tables away.
Okay, so if you haven't seen them, the sketches are her just sitting in an armchair talking to camera, sort of Ronnie Corbett-esque, Talking Heads-esque. But it's Victoria Wood's dialogue. It's really crisp, beautiful, specific dialogue. And it's an obvious antecedent to the character of Hyacinth Bucket. But I like Roy Clark. I like we'll talk about the writing later on, but he's no Victoria Wood. And so I kind of watched those sketches of Kitty after watching Keeping Up Appearances, and I was like, oh, this is what it could have been. This is how good it could have been.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? You watch those Kitty sketches particularly, but even if you watch the Talking Heads, Alan Bennett's Talking Heads.
Had a little away day to London last year, and it was dog dirt everywhere. I spotted some on the pavement right outside Buckingham Palace. I wrote to the Queen about it. Had a charming letter back from a lady-in-waiting saying that Her Majesty appreciated my interest and that my letter had been passed on to the appropriate authority.
This is what Hyacinth Bucket could have been, and it's not.
But I think, to be fair to Roy Clark, there are flashes of that in Keeping Up Appearances. There are some beautifully written lines. But they're few and far between, because it's a lot easier for Victoria Wood to write a 4-minute sketch than it is to write 6 half hours of sitcom.
Yeah, I'll grant you 44 episodes of Keeping Up Appearances in 5 years. But yeah, maybe 6 scripts total. I mean,
there's not a lot of variety.
There's such a basic foundation structure to the show, and line after line after line. And like you say, oh, it's my sister Violet, the one with room for a pony and a Mercedes. But it's always the same. It's not like, oh, every time Violet rings, it's a different thing that she's showing off about. It's always the same thing. And, Sheridan, the same thing. And there's just a set structure to how the things work. And it's so basic. That's why you can then, surely that's what you've got to sell, is the injection of interesting dialogue or funny phrasings or something. And
there are no surprises. I've watched 18 or 20 episodes and I was not surprised once.
No.
Nothing happened where I didn't see it coming.
Yeah, exactly. Even if they do something actually a bit different in an episode, it's so telegraphed. But yeah, it is frustrating to look back at something like the Victoria Wood sketches and go like, yeah, because Victoria Wood wrote Dinner Ladies and she managed to do that. And
that's true. I'm trying to throw Roy Clark a bone here, but yeah, absolutely right.
But to Victoria Wood's own admission, she really struggled with that. It was hard work. She did 2 series and said, like, oh, I can't do that anymore. And she never wrote another sitcom, you know, like, perhaps there is a reason for that. And bear in mind, at the same time, Roy Clark is churning out Last of the Summer Wine as well. We'll come back to Roy Clark. Let's talk about Patricia Routledge. So
yeah, so sticking with Patricia Routledge, we've got her up to 1990 then, I suppose.
And then this is her along,
this is her breakout role at 60.
Well, certainly in terms of public awareness, yeah, in terms of, you know, being more recognised. And sitcoms do that. How many times have we seen this, particularly in the older stuff, with those people like Reg Varney, Sheila Hancock, who were coming from quite a successful stage career and then became TV stars, and suddenly, like, you can't go to the supermarket without people knowing who you are. It does change the world considerably that you're living in, and it's not like you're getting really well recompensed for that. It's not like it pays that well. So you've got to kind of take that as it comes. So yeah, 5 years of keeping up appearances. It made Patricia Routledge a household name and very popular. And I think we talked about this being a modern classic. Maybe not, but it is a show that can be repeated ad nauseum. And
yeah, I think it is. Look, I don't like it, but I think you can describe it as a classic. You know, it was very popular and people still remember it. People still remember it with affection, probably because they haven't watched it recently. But it's a classic. It's definitely up there.
And it is the sort of thing that if you turn on UK Gold, it'll be on and it'll like that, fine.
Like One Foot in the Grave, unlike Game On, it has not aged at all. It's perfectly as watchable now as it was then.
So come to the end of that, 1995, as the last series goes out, and it's Patricia Routledge who says, I'm done with this. This is enough for me. Everyone else, all the other actors would have been happy to carry on. Roy Clark would have. We know Roy Clark's MO. He would have.
Roy Clark, yeah, he didn't. Roy Clark doesn't know how to make a timely exit, does he?
Yeah, exactly. So it is Patricia Routledge who kind of decides she's done enough, and it's because, you know, she's 65. She wants to kind of take advantage of this fame and kind of seek a few other opportunities while she's still got it, you know. And
right, so Hollywood beckons, does it?
Well, Hetty Wainthropp beckons.
Oh, yes, I remember that being a thing. I don't think I've ever seen it, but yes.
But interestingly,
is that just a generic detective?
Kind of, yeah. But actually, when I looked into it, I didn't know this. Apparently, it's based on a novel, I think, from the mid-'80s. And so the ITV did it as a one-off drama in 1990. So it was just before Keeping Up Appearances made...
With Patricia Routledge?
Yeah. So it predates that. It was filmed before. And it was just a one-off drama with an idea that it could go off to something else, and then it didn't. And that was that. She went off, she did Keeping Up Appearances. So when Keeping Up Appearances finishes, the BBC kind of just says, right, yeah, we'll have it. We'll make that. And they did the Hetty Wainthropp series. Slight differences, you know, they tweaked it a bit. Yeah, basically, it was just like, right, what can we do with Patricia Routledge? Oh, this is perfect. And that ran, you know, it did 27 episodes over just a few years. So they really churned that out. And then since then, much less in terms of TV work. But bear in mind how old she is. She's been working. She's done the classics, like she did Lady Bracknell in The Importance of Being Earnest. She did that, did a tour of that, you know, stuff like that, right? But then also, I saw her live. Oh God, this must be 6 or 7 years ago now. But I saw her in a live show, which was all about Dame Myra Hess. Do you know who Myra Hess is?
I don't think I know that name, Alan. Tell me more about Myra Hess.
She was a pianist and singer back in the sort of 30s, 40s. And during the Second World War, she spearheaded a campaign to bring musical concerts to the people at a very affordable price. And they were held in the National Art Gallery, you know, Trafalgar Square. Because they took all the art out because it might get bombed. They put it in a basement somewhere. And so they had this building. And so they just opened it up to the public at lunchtimes and had concerts. And she... was kind of the person behind all that, the curator, and the person who made it happen, and had to kind of, you know, it was for morale, you know, and that's how she did. But anyway, so the show is Patricia Routledge kind of representing her and kind of telling that story, but with using her letters, like verbatim letters and readings from her diary and stuff. So I went to see that. And it's just Patricia Routledge on stage, and she's sort of reading things, really. And then there's a pianist there, and then they occasionally do bits of music, like to kind of represent all that. And it was, you know, interesting enough, but a little bit of history I didn't know anything about. But what really struck me when I went to see it, that was Patricia Routledge, who was, 86 or 7 at the time?
Yeah.
her voice just boomed across the
Really?
room. You know, it's a big
Still
old
got it.
space.
Still
with an
projecting.
auditorium. That projection was there. Yeah, she's still got it. And, you know, she had to sort of be helped onto stage with a walking stick. It's not like she was, you know, absolutely spring chicken. But, yeah, the voice was still there, absolutely.
Wonderful.
So she did that for several years. She's more recently been doing a kind of like evening with Patricia Routledge kind of thing where you do a Q&A. And she only stopped that a couple of years ago, I think. So, you know, she's well into her 90s now. She seems to be okay.
Well, I like that. I do hope that's still the case when this goes out.
But yeah, she's
that's lovely. That's lovely to hear. Not just that she's long lived, which is great, of course, but that, you know, she's been able to keep working. That's lovely.
Yeah, and she seems to have made peace with the fact that Hyacinth Bucket is going to be her legacy. I don't think that's what she wanted, frankly.
I think we've covered Patricia Routledge then, and we will talk about the other cast members as we go along. I asked a question earlier about where this was set, and I think that's quite an interesting question because, you know, she's got this sort of RP, very affected accent, whereas the other members of the family, I can't quite place what their accents are. They're sort of, you know, generic common accent. I can't quite place it.
They are common accents, but they're very much northern common accents.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah.
Roy Clark, I won't quite go into the full details of the Roy Clark yet, but he is from Yorkshire and sets pretty much everything he writes in Yorkshire. You know, Last of the Summer Wine, Open All Hours. But this is not quite that specific.
In the opening titles, she's writing a letter and she's obviously got letterhead with her name and address on it. And the address is, are you ready? Right. Waney Edge, Blossom Avenue, Fuddleton.
Now that is a classic Roy Clark made-up Yorkshire name.
It's a classic made-up name. It's a classic made-up Yorkshire name, isn't it? Yeah. Fuddleton is supposed to be somewhere in Yorkshire. So that's how I interpreted it. But they don't sound like they're from Yorkshire.
There's a couple of references to the West Midlands, but very vague, sort of vaguely things. And then you've got Clive Swift is from Liverpool, Geoffrey Hughes, yeah, a Scouser as well. And, you know, all the actors are sort of generally northern, kind of Bolton, Tranmere, Manchester, that kind of vibe. So it's a bit more Lancashire than Yorkshire in terms of casting. But there's nothing that specific in it to really put it down. Roy Clark wrote the script and sent it off, so he didn't have anything to do with that. So I guess they could do with what they want. Okay, shall we start our episode? Shall we get into the episode and we can use that, as we usually do, as a jumping off point for the other actors and characters? We actually start with Hyacinth and Richard in bed, in the same bed, which, given the nature of their relationship, is something of a surprise. This feels like it should be classic sitcom, 2 single beds with a little bedside table between them. Isn't that just a change in sign of the times? Like that was, you know, George and Mildred in the 1970s. You couldn't have 2 people in bed together unless they were Morecambe and Wise. Well, exactly. But I think it made me think about there is a real lack of physical affection in this relationship. Oh, God, yeah. In fact, I believe Richard says at some point, "You went off me after Sheridan was born," or something like that. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was sort of since they had a son. It must be. Well, we open up and essentially that we see them in bed, and it's an encapsulation of the relationship because she's wearing rollers, in other words, preparing to present herself to the world, and he's just asleep, just because to get some sweet, merciful escape. We get a little setup here where Hyacinth is theoretically talking to Richard, but he's asleep, so we as the audience are finding out the information, which he is not. A little bit of dramatic irony, in which she has remembered that it is their wedding anniversary, and let's assume that he won't remember that because that's where hilarity ensues. It's your classic sitcom trope. It is a very classic sitcom-y story, this, the forgotten husband forgets the anniversary. Yeah. To be fair to Roy Clark, we don't get too many kind of really cliche sitcom storylines quite like this. I'm all right with it. Using the classic tropes not a bad thing inherently. It's just you've got to make it funny, you know. And even in the nature of the show itself, Richard has recently retired, taken early retirement. So you probably guess that maybe the anniversary date was in his diary or in his work diary, and now he just doesn't keep track of days anymore. So he's just lost it completely. He's let himself go. Yeah. But yes. And incidentally, did you notice that the furnishings in their bedroom, the pillowcases, the duvet cover, and the wallpaper have identical patterns? It's really weird. They're very floral. Very floral, correct. Yeah, everything matches. She's on cloud 9. She's really happy because it's their anniversary. She's in an unusually happy mood. And then we cut to the second part of the world of Daisy and Onslow.
Can I say, before we get into the details here, the standard fare for keeping up appearances was we have these two sides of the family, and they're along on these separate sort of parallel lines, and then they converge and something happens and embarrassment ensues and so on and so forth. They don't converge in this episode.
They do not.
We have completely separate plots. Like there is no connection between them whatsoever.
Yes, and our subplot with Daisy and Onslow is basically wrapped up in the first 8 minutes. It doesn't even like continue through.
It's like watching EastEnders. It's like, well, what's happening in this house? What's happening in that house? There's no connection. No connection
at all. And I will say, when I started watching through Keeping Up Appearances, like I've seen it before, but I cracked through them all again. And there is that kind of dawning sense of dread that, Onslow and Daisy are going to be in every episode. Because I feel like these guys should just be, the embarrassing relatives who turn up maybe half the episodes, like the vicar. It turns up every now and then when the plot requires it.
This episode is a perfect example of where they are not they are surplus to requirements.
Yes.
They're in there because they need to be in there.
And usually they do converge, to be fair. Usually they will have a plot line that is completely irrelevant, but basically it will pull in, and at some point they will meet and be like, oh my God, they're so embarrassing because they're disgusting slobs. But here, this is a particularly bad example. And I'm going to say it's bad writing, okay? It should not be there. If you're going to pull them in somewhere later on. Basically, what happens is we set up the idea of the ghost. The vicar comes round and it turns out it's an old lady. We'll come into that in more detail. And that's it. It's 2 scenes.
Yeah, that's it.
Even if we're going to do that, put a scene in later where they turn up at the house or something. I don't know. Tie it in.
Well, you're struggling to come up with an idea because
I know
they're completely separate storylines.
I at least thought that it might tie into the burglary thing. Maybe they get burgled, or they think they've been burgled because someone sold the telly without telling anyone.
Yeah.
Let's make it the relative content-wise, even if it don't come together. It is bad writing, and to be fair, it's not usually that bad. If you're going to make Onslow, Daisy, Rose, and the dad our secondary characters, make them secondary characters. Let's see what they're doing. Let's have them their own plots. It always feels like a subplot afterthought. And oh god, I've got to put Onslow and Daisy. What can I do? They're drinking in the house, and Onslow wants some chips. Right, that's good. Got that in. Done. It's pathetic. And it always feels like I'm watching 2 different shows that have been smashed together. Even the style of it feels like the Onslow Daisy world is a different world. It's a different style of comedy. You do get a lot more of that kind of early Last of the Summer Wine philosophical kind of navel-gazing from Onslow and Daisy, where you don't get that with Hyacinth at all. The Hyacinth side is pure comedy farce.
Yeah.
Tonally, they feel different. They don't match at all. I don't like that they're both together.
Seeing as you basically summarised the plot, Daddy's disturbed and they think there's a ghost in his room, and it turns out they get the vicar to exorcise the ghost, and it turns out to be just some woman that Daddy brought home. Right, that's it. So I propose that we don't go through each scene in excruciating detail. We can sort of revisit it when the show does. But like you say, that is easily wrapped up. What I would like to talk about is this relationship between Daisy and Onslow.
Right.
What's going on there? Essentially, the recurring gag, and my God, it recurs, is that Daisy's gagging for it, and Onslow's not having any of it.
Yeah. Which something that sort of develops over the first 2 series, and then Roy Clark obviously settles on that as his gag there, and that's just what he does every episode, cut and paste that bit into the episode. And this is, again, we've talked about this before, it is a classic sitcom trope, a sort of undesirable, dowdy woman who's absolutely gagging for it, and the husband who is like not having it at all. It's on the buses, it's George and Mildred to an extent, or it's a classic sitcom trope. And here we do nothing different or special with it whatsoever.
Yeah.
They're fat.
I mean, Onslow's, apart from Hyacinth, Onslow is the breakout character, isn't he? He's the most recognisable character in this show.
Mm.
He's kind of the anti-Hyacinth. He's like, this is what I am, take me or leave me, and I don't care what you think.
And he takes a real philosophical approach to it. It's like he can intellectually justify his laziness, which is classic Roy Clark, and I'd say that feels a bit more like Last of the Summer Wine. I quite like that. I quite like the writing. I think Geoffrey Hughes is excellent.
Geoffrey Hughes is excellent.
And I think that is why perhaps Onslow stands out a little more from the crowd, because he is bringing something to it.
Well, let's talk about Jeffrey Hughes. We have mentioned him before. He was in one of the Till Death Us Do Part films, wasn't he? We've mentioned him there.
That's right, yeah. In fact, one of his first TV credits was a few episodes of The Likely Lads. Yeah, so he was sort of in that when he was a young man.
I think I said when we talked about him last time, he's Eddie Yates to me. When I was a kid, he was in Coronation Street as Eddie Yates, and that's kind of the first thing that jumps to my mind. That's above Onslow in my head.
But yeah, everybody's favourite bin man, Eddie Yates, and that was kind of what he was known for many years. But yeah, before that, the Till Death Us Do Part film, we saw him in one episode of Please Sir as well. He was actually a regular in Curry and Chips, the classic Spike Milligan Irish Pakistani character.
That the BBC, for some unknown reason, have not deleted.
And Jeffrey Hughes was one of the other workers in that. So he was a regular in that. That was 1969 as well, the same year as the Till Death Us Do Part film. One episode of Dad's Army, that sort of thing. Here's one thing. Do you remember this? He was in I Love It.
Oh, yeah. Well, we talked about that when we talked about Red Dwarf, didn't we?
Yeah, he was the voice of the dog puppet, I think it was.
No, I don't remember that, but I believe you, and I'm delighted.
But yeah, then Keeping Up Appearances, definitely, again, one of those roles that sort of people go, oh, yeah, that's what I know him from. And after this, the one kind of notable sitcom role was in The Royal Family. He turned up in that as an occasional Twiggy, one of the local kind of, he always had some dodgy jeans to sell. So that was a nice thing. And he got ill and died like relatively young. In fact, when Keeping Up Appearances started, he would have been 46 years old.
Oh, really?
So younger than you, Gareth.
You've done that to me again.
But yeah, and he died relatively young of cancer, I believe. But yeah, he had a very solid career, playing sort of fat, lovable slobs. so Onslow really was kind of.
Would you say that Onslow is lovable?
Well, when we see Daisy and Onslow, we sort of see their lifestyle. He is a big fat slob. He sits watching the telly. He's drinking constantly, and he's just looking at the horse racing. He's gambling or whatever money he's got. But there is some. We are supposed to like him. He is a lovable.
I know,
he's written as lovable.
Like you just described a whole lot of things he does there, which are pretty unpleasant.
Yeah.
But to me, it's the way he treats Daisy. And I'm not talking about sex here. He shows no affection towards her. He shows no love, nothing. There's no emotion there. And I think that's all he's missing. I think if he just showed a bit of affection towards his wife, I would really like him. But as it is, he's just got nothing. Imagine living with that guy. Awful.
And I think it would be, you could have a lot of fun with that, where they're, in the same way that Daisy will like go up to him and like rub his belly and go, oh, you're so gorgeous. Like he could do the same back to her, and we would really like these two people as a couple. And from what I understand as well, the two of them, the actors, and Mary Miller, who plays the other sister, they all really got on. They were always very playful with each other, and that they brought a lot of that energy into the characters.
Yeah, I can see that.
So I think that would have been nice to embrace that. The problem is that Roy Clark didn't know any of that because he never went on set or met any actors.
Right. Okay. Well, just a couple more things on the character of Onslow before we move on.
Right.
Firstly, his tattoos. He's got like old-fashioned tattoos before tattoos were cool. The sorts of mum and dad tattoos.
The sort of thing you get in the Navy.
Exactly. Yeah. I remember when I was a kid, there was a teacher at school who had a tattoo. You could see it under his shirt, and that was like scandalous. Like, I would imagine. I don't know the last time a teacher training college turned out a teacher without a tattoo, but it must have been a few years.
Yeah, and I think they're real tattoos. They don't seem to.
You think they're Jeffrey Hughes' tattoos?
I think so, because they're remarkably consistent and also look very real. They don't look like they've been drawn on that morning.
I hadn't thought of that, but maybe you're right. They are quite faded. Yeah, they've got that sort of old-fashioned tattoo fade. Yeah. Also, so the other thing that I really sort of drilled into here is that Onslow drinks Stone's Bitter.
Right, I don't know.
Now this is not
my
buttons, Alan. Yeah, so listeners may know I don't drink anymore, but bloody hell, I used to. And Stone's Bitter in the mid-90s was a big favourite of mine. What I didn't realise, because I've done a little bit of a deep dive onto Stone's Bitter, it's quite a local brew. It was brewed in Sheffield. It was like originally a Yorkshire beer. Yeah, it's all owned by, an American brewery now, but it was, it's brewed in Yorkshire. So I'm wondering, and I'm curious to know from our listeners, if you're in London or in Somerset, have you ever heard of Stone's Bitter? Does that register for you, or is that just did you think that was just some generic made up thing that the sitcom had created? So here's something people might remember. It had adverts in the 80s on the telly starring Michael Angelis from the Live Birds. I remember that adverts. But the catchphrase was, "Wherever you may wander, there's no taste like Stones." And they sponsored the rugby league, which again, if any of our listeners in Somerset have ever heard of rugby league, then please do that. A nice flash of alcohol-related nostalgia for me.
Let's have a quick word on Judy Cornwell, who plays Daisy. There's not a lot of stuff to talk about in terms of other sitcom things or anything like that. But how do you feel about her performance as Daisy, as a sort of
well, we're talking about the actor. I've got things to say about the character, but
okay, yeah.
The actor, I think she does a great job. There's a few things where there's a little bit of sort of overacting, going into camera, that kind of stuff, where it's very broad sitcom acting. But it's a broad sitcom, isn't it? I don't think we can hold too much against her for that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think Judy Cornwell, Mary Miller, who plays Rose, they never really do anything that makes me think, oh, that was good. Whereas Jeffrey Hughes sort of stands above. It does feel like he's doing something with it. It just feels quite basic. You could probably replace them. I mean, Mary Miller was a replacement for Sheila Stelfox, who plays the character in the first series. I think you can replace them pretty easily.
Well, okay, so what about the character of Daisy? Because I'll tell you what I think. Daisy is the only person in this entire sitcom that I like. I think she's sweet. I think she's lovely.
She is sort of sweet but naive.
I don't know about naive. I mean, she's put upon.
Yeah.
You probably want to give her a shake and say, get the hell out of this life. But how does she? But she's sweet. She cares about other people. Even when they're all sort of saying, oh God, what will Hyacinth say? She actually wants Hyacinth to be happy. It's not just she doesn't want to be ticked off by Hyacinth.
Yeah, I agree, really, yeah. We'll come into this later, but what about Richard? Don't you not like Richard? Just a sneak preview of a later conversation.
I despise Richard.
Oh, okay, we'll come back up to that. We'll come back to that later. That's too big a conversation for this.
How can you not like Richard? You just feel so sorry for him.
No, but I think Daisy's lovely. And the other question I have is why is she looking after Daddy and not Hyacinth, who's clearly in a much better financial position to do it? Because she's lovely. She's the one who picks up the pieces.
Because Hyacinth won't have him in the house because he makes a mess and disturbs her routine.
Which is all the more reason why I just want Onslow to throw her a bone, for God's sake.
Yeah, exactly. And
help a girl out. Come on.
Hyacinth will say things like, I love my family, but that's no reason why I need to be seen with them in public, stuff like that. But she does seem to, she does maintain connections.
She is ashamed of them, literally ashamed of them.
Yeah, but she has not abandoned them entirely.
That's true.
There is something there that she's holding on to. But I think it's more out of a sense of duty that you look after your family rather than she wants to. Particularly with relations to Daddy, if we should talk about him briefly.
Yep.
The Daddy character, because in this scene, in fact, in this episode, he's basically complaining that he thinks his bedroom is haunted. He's seen a spectral female figure in there. But that in itself is quite unusual because usually he doesn't talk. Here we have a full-on conversation with him where he describes what's happening with a spooky apparition in his bedroom.
Well, I'm glad you said that because having not watched every single episode, probably just under half of the episodes, this is the only time I saw him speak. So I did think, I wondered if it was rare or unique.
It was. And in fact, in the first series, if you recall,
he's on scene.
They go very great pains not to show his face and like who it actually is. So I assumed it was just like a stuntman who was probably not as old as you sort of think he is, or whatever, or they just want an extra and they didn't want to kind of commit to it. There is quite a lot of unseen characters in the show. So I think it was just sort of in that vein. But then, they eventually start showing him. It's the same guy all the way through.
Yeah.
Called George Webb, I think.
Anything to tell me about George Webb? Because I didn't recognise him at all.
This is it. I feel like in that first series, he's not been brought in as an actor. It's an extra role. We need an old man.
So he's just an old man. He's not an actor. He's just an old man.
I don't know. I don't think he's certainly not. It's not like he's got a numerous credits, put it that way.
All right, okay.
But yeah, why now suddenly he can talk? There seems to be no sort of consistency in what Roy Clark is writing here. We get the same with my sister Violet. Violet is an unseen character on the other end of the phone. She's the fancy sister.
Yeah.
Until series 5, in which she turns up one episode with very little fanfare, doesn't do much, and then sort of makes guest appearances throughout the rest of the series.
I wanted to ask you about this because, I watched an episode from series 5 and, Violet now exists. I thought she was just on the... And I'd missed the sort of introduction. So is she introduced in any... with no fanfare, you say?
No. She gets invited to the picnic and she turns up.
Right, fine.
And then nothing happens. Can we talk about Roy Clark? Shall we get into Roy Clark?
Let's talk about Roy Clark.
I think we need to talk about the writing here.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, he was born and raised in a little village in the outskirts of Doncaster, not far from where we ourselves were raised. And born in 1930, so just a year younger than Patricia Routledge.
Yeah.
To put it into context, he is, at time of recording, still alive. Ran a litany of jobs. He served in the army. Okay. He was a policeman, and other just general odd jobs, and wanted to be a writer. Finally, kind of made it. He was well into his 30s by the time he was getting stuff produced. Started off on radio, then the TV. Yeah. Very typical of that 60s
BBC
process,
progression.
Right? Yeah, did a lot of drama first, and sitcom seemed to come a little bit later. His first sitcom was The Misfit.
Oh, I don't know that.
Which was for ITV, actually. It starred Ronald Fraser as this a Brit who had been living in Malaysia for many, many years and comes back to Britain in the swinging 60s, early
like
70s.
It might be a bit racist.
Well, he comes back to Britain and he's just, he finds himself at odds with the permissive society. I don't know how racist it is. It's just about him, not fitting in with the modern world. And he's this old empirical fellow. But then that was in the early 70s, 1970, 71. And then I guess people thought of him as a sitcom guy then, because in 1973, he wrote the pilot episodes of both Last of the Summer Wine and Open All Hours.
Okay.
So people were coming to him and going, we're doing a pilot season, write something for us.
Yeah.
As far as I understand, the inception of Last of the Summer Wine was the producer said, I want something with 3 old men. Go. So that was that. So this was his period of real development. 1974, he wrote the pilot of Oh No, It's Selwyn Froggatt.
Yeah.
Although he didn't end up writing the series. He didn't write the series because he was like, these aren't my characters. I don't know them. This isn't my kind of world. I don't want it. So he only ended up writing the pilot of that. Last of the Summer Wine obviously ran for 37 years. Open All Hours did run, but sporadically over the next sort of decade. Then, in the mid-70s, he does The Growing Pains of P.C. Penrose, about a Yorkshire policeman. Mm-hmm. That was followed by Rosie, which was essentially the same thing, but ran for longer. Potter, starring Arthur Lowe. He did that for a few series.
Yes. Yeah, I remember that.
That even... Arthur Lowe died, and they just replaced him with someone else, so that even survived that. Then he, a series of other things in the 80s that weren't very successful. We've talked about Man's Best Friends before. Yeah. They did First of the Summer Wine, which was a prequel to Last of the Summer Wine. They did a couple of series that never really thing. And then it's 1990 Keeping Up Appearances, where suddenly it's like, oh, boom, you've got a success again. You've got another hit.
Yeah. It's weird, isn't it? We've seen this before. Like, some of the most successful sitcoms, the writers had a lot of flops as well. And, clearly talented writers. It's just there's just so many factors, aren't there? So many variables that go into making a success. Yeah,
I think that's just the nature of it. They did even in 1992, while this was still a hit. He and Harold Snowd, who was the director of Keeping Up Appearances, they did another show called Don't Tell Father that just did one series and didn't do anything. But he had Tony Britton in it, a young Caroline Quentin. Like good solid actors.
Yeah.
A pairing that we know works. Who knows? Some things just don't hit, do they? I guess that's just the nature of the business. And then after that, and bear in mind, he was sort of retirement age by this point, so perhaps people weren't looking to him for the next fresh young sitcom hit. Do you age out? We've talked about this before, haven't we?
Fashions change, I'm not saying that once you're 70 you're incapable of writing, far from it, but that your reference points are considered outdated, even if they're not. The TV industry is very fashion driven and conscious of that. They're always looking for the next young thing, aren't they?
But also, bear in mind, he did carry on with Last of the Summer Wine. That was his retirement gig. That finished in 2010, 11, I think. And then not long after that, he picked up Open All Hours, and they did Still Open All Hours, a sequel. Which is very much Last of the Summer Wine, the new class. It's the same principle of just creating this great big ensemble cast and just churning out the same script every week. But that ran for 6 years. It replaced Last of the Summer Wine as the sort of a good gig for an actor when you're in your 70s. Hasn't done anything since then, but he is in his 90s.
That idea of you said there about ensemble casts. That's the problem with Keeping Up Appearances. We watched Heidi High last year, and that's got a huge cast, but it felt to me like they were better at using them appropriately. I don't know with this with Keeping Up Appearances. I'll give you an example. Rose. I don't think we ever if Rose wasn't there, I don't think we would miss her. I don't think he's ever really adding anything.
I agree. What about Emmett?
Exactly. Yeah, we'll get to Emmett. Yes. Yeah. He does the same shtick every week, and without it, the show would be fine.
I agree completely. That's what I mean about the writing here. It feels really cut and paste. Just doing the same. Like you could write a Keeping Up Appearances script purely by putting in the tent poles of this line. She answers the phone and says, "Lady of the house speaking." Oh, it's the sister.
Cut to next door.
Liz comes round for coffee and spills it. You could build that, and then all you need to add in is like, what's the thing this week? Oh, the woman at the church is like taking over the jumble sale, and Hyacinth wants to be in charge. Like, there you go. That's an idea.
Done.
Boom.
You're absolutely right, and that's the problem. I think that's my problem with Keeping Up Appearances. Having watched umpteen episodes, I was so sick of it. So sick of it.
Yeah, I mean, having watched them all, I'm saying this, and I think it is pretty weak writing. I find it very watchable, and I do find it quite charming and perfectly fine. It's not good, but I don't go, oh my God, this again. It's fine.
No, that's interesting. So that was exactly my attitude to Heidi High. I found myself just watching it in the background, and exactly like you just described. This is fine. But no, this was basically, she was getting on my nerves. That is the problem. I found her aggravating. I found the character aggravating.
Right, yeah, fair enough. I think what it is for me, there's just a real lack of spark. It's just the same. It's churning it out. It just needs a little bit of sparkle. It needs a bit of Victoria Wood dialogue. Would lift this.
There are some flashes of that. There's some lovely dialogue. A couple of lines which land really well. But the problem is they're diluted in the show. That's the. I wrote at one point, I've got a note here, I think I would prefer to read a script of this than watch the show. Because I think there is some nice dialogue in there. But again, the character just grates me. I just don't like her very much.
So let's go back into the episode. We've done the Daisy and Onslow scene.
Yeah.
To come back to Hyacinth's house, and we've got the old postman bit. Again, another cut and paste bit.
Yeah, every single week exactly the same. So you describe it.
The postman comes up to Hyacinth's house with some post, as you would, and then is like, "Oh my God, I can't stand that woman. I daren't go to the house."
Yeah.
And then inevitably
she answers the door because she's waiting for him, and he has to talk to her.
And I don't get it, because Emmett is the same. Emmett daren't leave the house to walk to work because she might jump out and sing at him. But the worst that's going to happen is you have to do 20 seconds of small talk and then go, "All right, well, I'm off to work." Like, what?
Yeah.
And when she does talk to them, like, what happens? Nothing. It's
like she's overbearing and unpleasant, but it's not that bad.
and as the postman particularly, you have no responsibility. All right, love, yeah, whatever. I'll let them know. See ya.
Yeah.
Like, what? Yeah. Who cares?
I have written in my notes here, why doesn't he just post a letter and off?
Yeah, exactly.
I think I was annoyed by now.
Yeah.
I mean, posties are really busy. It reminds me of a time I work from home, and a couple of years ago the weather was pretty bad, and the postman had knocked on my door to deliver something, and I offered him a cup of tea. I said, "Oh, do you want a cup of tea, mate?" And he just went, "No, thanks," and walked off. I was absolutely mortified, but that's how you deal with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it's lonely working at home.
Of course, in Rising Damp, the post lady comes in and kisses him under the mistletoe.
Well, I wasn't looking for that. I was just offering it was raining, I was offering them brew.
The actor playing the postman, though, do you recognise him?
No, who's that?
He's not in the first series, there's a different postman than that, but later on it's David Jansen. He's probably best known because he took over the role of Hair Flick in Hello Hello for the last series.
Oh, right, okay. Now, I do remember that happening, but when you say Hair Flick, I remember oh my gosh, I feel bad that I can't remember him. But yes, but I didn't know that, but that is quite interesting, thank you.
But his big major regular role was Get Some In. We've talked about that quite a lot because it was an Esmond and Larby show. And he was also in an episode of Please Sir, and he was in a handful of episodes of Brushstrokes. So Esmond and Larby must have liked him, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, he's one of those guys who knocked about the sitcom world quite a lot. And we have the odd little guest roles, like the milkman comes round, or, there's a someone comes round to read the gas meter, blah, blah, blah. There's an old lady in the street she's talking to. There's a lot of that stuff that are generally, with exceptions, are not done very well. The actors are just turn up, do the line. There's not a lot of joy in any of it.
Okay.
And I want to talk about the acting overall and the process, because Roy Clark, he was a writer. He wrote the script. He sent it in, and that was that. Didn't have anything else to do with it. We've seen a lot of writers being very hands-on and essentially producers.
But he was literally just a writer.
Harold Snowd, who is the producer and director here of Keeping Up Appearances.
He's the creative force behind it, you're saying?
Well, he is a producer-director and, a company man, worked his way up the BBC, all that sort of stuff. First directing credits were on Dad's Army. He did some Are You Being Served? He was brought in to do Ever Decreasing Circles partway through, things like that. He's the sort of guy you bring in as a safe pair of hands.
Yeah.
And he then has a couple of shows that were his shows. Don't Wait Up throughout the 80s, that was one that he kind of shepherded through all the way through. And then Keeping Up Appearances was another. And from what I've heard, the actors speaking of him, they've said he really would let you play around with it. He gave you a lot of freedom to kind of make some decisions as a character. But I'm not getting an impression from what I'm seeing that there's a lot of direction going on with the actors.
Okay.
Particularly like your guest stars, it is very much turn up, do your line, right, thanks, here's your 70 quid. The general gist I'm getting to here is Roy Clark would send the scripts off and not have anything to do with it. And in fact, I heard Josephine Tewson in a interview said she met Roy Clark. He came to set once. Right. And she asked him,
wow.
So Josephine Tewson, who plays the neighbour Elizabeth, she said, so have I got a husband? What's the story? He was like, oh, I don't know, I suppose, maybe. Am I a single mother then? Don't know, you can have a husband if you want. So is he away working? Yeah. He doesn't care. He hasn't given any thought. And they received the scripts. There's no character description. There's no background info or anything. It's like what is on the page, their dialogue.
It's dialogue.
Do something with that. You make it yourself. And so it does seem like Harold Snowd welcomed the actors, the regular actors, to kind of create their own backstory, make that work for them. And I think that works to a large extent. I think it really works with Richard. We'll talk about that a bit later when we come to Richard and Clive Swift. But it does feel like the actors have had to take the brunt of responsibility of making this a character. And so if you're a day player and you just turn up for one day and you don't want to make a big decision, you just want to do as you're told and not cause any problems. You turn up, you do the line, you go away. And so it just feels very, again, uninspired, very just un. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for this week. But, just like Keeping Up Appearances, we will be back next week with more of the same. In the meantime, if you would like to follow us on the social medias, we are at BritcomPod, or you can find us on Facebook by searching for British Sitcom History. And we will see you next time for more Hyacinth Bucket. Bouquet!